thought maybe, Congressman, we talked a little bit about some of the federal approaches. The president signed 23 executive orders recently around gun violence, addressing gun violence. I thought I'd ask what you think the results of that will be. Will they get some of that legislation through Congress? And then second, this is something you could start with, but I think we'd have several opinions, was the 1994-2004 assault weapon ban, would you judge that was a success, which was federal?
On the executive orders, I listened to the 23 proposals, and some of them are very legitimate exercises of the presidential prerogative to instruct his executive agencies on how to carry out their business. And that's within his power. They make sense. I have no objection whatsoever. If he wants to encroach on Congress's power to make law, and I know he's done that in other things that we won't get into tonight, the courts have agreed with that statement, then I do object. He can't make law, but he can do the executive orders within the agencies. So that's how I feel about executive orders in general and those 23 in particular. The legislation that's coming forward, starting in the Senate, Dianne Feinstein has a bill to do the revival of the assault weapon ban that was in effect until a few years back. I don't see how that has worked. I mean, the people who obey gun control laws are the good people, the law-abiding citizens, people like we have here today. The bad guys or the mentally ill people are the ones who disregard laws. And if we look at Chicago, Chicago has the highest murder rate in the country. At the same time, they have some of the most strict gun control laws in the country. So if the gun control laws worked, Chicago would be a safer place. I'm just, common sense would tell me that. So I am opposed to Dianne Feinstein's law. I'm not sure it will even make it over to the House, and I don't see it going anywhere in the House should it come over from the Senate.
Okay, great. Anybody else want to?
Yeah, I applaud President Barack Obama for his leadership in addressing gun violence in our nation. I'm really pleased that our Vice President Biden has commissioned and he's consulting with people, so he's not rushing out with a lot of proposals. He's consulting a lot of different people so that we can most likely come up with some reasonable approach to address this issue for our country. So I think that he's on the right track. It's really frustrating when I hear things like, it's not going to work, it didn't work then, it's not going to work now. I think that kind of attitude does not address the problem. And I think that's why here in the state of Colorado, we have an opportunity to really set the example for the nation by taking an approach that we think that's reasonable, that's responsible. So what has passed out of the House, I think that's a good first step to address gun violence in our nation, in our state.
Can I respond to that? And David got a question. No, David's got it. David's time was up too.
I had a debate on Saturday and I was accused of being anti-progress. And I think a little bit of what you were saying, Representative Fields, is similar. We have a plan in place. And in fact, since the expiration of the federal assault weapons ban, we have seen murder rates decline in this country. We have seen violent decline. We have seen juvenile violence decline. And the reason is that in the 1980s and the 1990s, we put harsh penalties in place for people who committed violent crime. We built prison cells, federal and state, and the result has been a declining homicide rate. And if we continue with that strategy, we will continue to see a declining homicide rate. We need to deal with the twisted minds who commit these crimes and not the twisted metal that is used in committing the crimes.
The plan, I'm not quite sure what plan you're mentioning, but it's not working because we have 34 people that are dying a day because of gun violence. 34 people. Since Sandy Hook, there's been over 2,000 people that have been murdered by guns. So the plan that you're speaking about is not working. We need to be doing more.
Governor, I'd say that the responsible thing to do is to look at what works and what doesn't, and to pass legislation that can work rather than things that have been already proven to fail. When the 1994 ban was enacted, part of the compromises necessary to get it through Congress were that it would have a 10-year sunset, and there would be a Department of Justice mandated study of how well it worked, and then Congress, after the 10 years, could decide whether to renew. Congress chose not to renew in 2004, in part because the interim studies and then the final studies conducted by the Urban Institute, which is a very highly respected left-leaning think tank in Washington, D.C., their final report said this had no beneficial effect. It didn't save lives, and the 10-round magazine ban didn't even seem to affect the number of shots that were fired in various criminal instances as far as they could find. So it had zero beneficial effect. No crime reduction, no lives saved. Just today, a very interesting leak has come out of another leak has come out of the National Institute of Justice. The NIJ is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. They produced a report on January 4th about various proposals that were being circulated on gun control. What they said on assault weapons was it's useless, it will do no good. These guns are involved in a very small fraction of crimes. Indeed, rifles in general are quite underrepresented in crime. It said on the magazine ban, the only way, according to the National Institute of Justice, which leaked out, no wonder the White House didn't want this to come out, it said the only way a magazine ban does any good is if you confiscate all the existing magazines. Now, if you want to go to that police state level and try to round up 40 million magazines from an unwilling population and see what kind of chaos that leads to, well, the National Institute of Justice says if you can accomplish it, maybe you have a magic magnet, that'll work. But it says the existing supply is so large that unless you're willing to go for confiscation, a ban on future production will do no good. And this is Eric Holder's National Institute of Justice, not exactly one of the top pro-gun organizations in the country.
It's very, it's very difficult, truthfully impossible, to prove a negative. So just like when we talk about Chicago has the highest murder rate in the country, I won't dispute that. And they have the strictest gun control laws, you know, I won't even dispute that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that their murder rate wouldn't be 3 or 4 times what it is, or even 30 or 40% higher than it is, but for those laws. I mean, just because something is after something doesn't mean that it prevented something or that it caused something. So, I mean, there's plenty of statistics here, but there's not much in the way of causation. And the reality is, and I know this from being on the street, there's so much that happens that's just instantaneous crime of passion kind of stuff. And the same with suicides as well as homicides, and the same with accidents. And when these guns are not available, or these magazines are not available because it was a little bit more difficult to get them, there'll still be plenty of them on the street, hopefully in the hands of folks that know how to use them and know how to safeguard them so that they don't fall into hands where they just do damage. But when there's a little bit of a hurdle, who knows how many suicides we're going to prevent? Who knows how many homicides we're going to prevent? Who knows how many accidents we're going to prevent?
Senator, if some of these laws had been in effect, it would have made no difference, unfortunately. Like universal background check. That's one of the proposals floating around in Denver and in Washington. The Aurora shooting, Newtown, and Tucson. 2 of those 3 killers passed background checks. The third one killed his mother and stole her weapons. Background checks were not an issue. So we can propose these laws, and they would not have made a difference. Let me quote Joe Biden. Just last month, he spoke to his Democratic colleagues in the Senate. Nothing we are going to do is fundamentally going to alter or eliminate the possibility of another mass shooting or guarantee that we will bring gun deaths down. These laws are sometimes, I hate to say this, but people in public office want to be seen, they care, they want to be seen as doing something, they care, but what they're proposing will not make a difference and would not have made a difference.
Just so we're clear, what Vice President Biden said there's no guarantee. He was not saying there wouldn't be a difference, and I think if he was here, he would take issue.
And Governor, it's just, you know, here we go again, talking about what won't work. And what we do know is that background checks do work. In fact, 80% of the people in Colorado, voters, has suggested and has been polled that they believe that background checks is a good, reasonable approach to save life and to make our community less dangerous. 80%. The reason it works is because we currently have background checks right now. When you buy a new gun, you have to perform a background check. And then if you buy a gun at a gun show, you have to perform a background check. So this is going to close the loophole. So if you want to sell a gun privately, then you have to perform a background check. It's my understanding with the CBI, they have, just in 1 month alone, there's been like, I think it was in January, 900, close to 1,000 people were denied access to guns. And the trigger that keeps them from getting a gun is because they've already been identified as someone that's a felon or someone who's been involved in a domestic relationship where there's a restraining order on them, or they're mentally ill. We know that background checks can save lives. And so for you to say that that's not going to make a difference when it already does, and what we're trying to do is expand a program that already has been proven that it works. So I think we need to move forward with that.
Let's move along. And Dr. Kopel, maybe I'll start with you this, because we are spending a lot of time talking about guns, and we are going to come back to guns, but I thought it would be worth not just treating the issue completely in a silo and say, begin to talk a little bit about mental health. And do you have suggestions and ideas of how we could address issues around mental health when we're discussing gun violence?
Sure. The real thread that runs through mass murder in this country is not the particular type of gun or magazine. It's mental illness. The age of onset for schizophrenia is so frequently late teens, early 20s for young males. This is overwhelmingly the perpetrators of these crimes, and we see so often they were people who were identified by their community as dangerously mentally ill. The Tucson murderer got kicked out of Pima Community College because he was dangerously mentally ill, and the administration recognized that, and then there was no follow-up. You kick him out of the college, but you keep him on the streets. That's a recipe for what happened. We've seen that Adam Lanza, the Connecticut murderer, his mother was working to have him institutionalized, but it hadn't happened, and she apparently quite recklessly left her firearms available to him. We know about the Aurora murderer and how his psychiatrist actually broke psychiatric confidentiality to identify him as a danger to the CU Threat Crisis Team, and we presume she did it under the only legal circumstances she could, the Tarasoff rule, because he was an imminent, violent danger. The homicide rate, and putting aside these mass crimes which attract so much attention, there's so much crime perpetrated by that very small subset of mentally ill people who are, as a whole, are not more dangerous than anyone else. But that small subset of the violently mentally ill does commit a lot of crimes. 1/3 of the variation, state to state, in homicide rates is due to the weakest states versus the stronger states in their involuntary civil commitment laws. 1/6 of the people in prison in the United States for homicide right now in state prisons are mentally ill. This is something that is long overdue for us to start addressing. You know, why do we have so many more of these crimes now than we did in 1962, when you could walk in, you could be 15 years old, or 1964, you could walk into a hardware store and buy an AR-15 rifle with whatever magazines you wanted, no questions asked in most of this country. And we didn't have these kinds of crimes. And the difference is we had institutionalization then in an effective way. We don't have it now. We need to, as we reform the system, make absolutely sure to protect due process better than we did in the 50s and the 60s, but with proper due process protections. That's absolutely essential for public safety in general and reducing mass murders.
Ken, you want to add anything to that?
And I think we agree on an awful lot in what you just said, and I truly hope that we are going to fund mental illness a lot better than we have. I mean, I've been working at that for 6 years, and I'm happy to have this newfound support. I just hope that it's real and that we're actually going to put some resources behind it. But the other thing that we have to recognize is the rest of the world is pretty much as mentally ill as we are. And they don't have the same levels of gun violence that we have, because we do make it so easy to get guns. And so we've got to address this in both ways, not just in mental illness and not just in making sure that we do everything we can to make sure people don't get guns that shouldn't have them, because our hindsight is 20/20. But again, I can tell you from being on the street, I mean, I ran into a bunch of crazy folks, but I couldn't tell you which one was actually going to pull out a gun and go postal. So we've got to take this seriously, and we've got to really invest in mental health resources and really have the community-based solutions that we talked about in the 60s and never did.
Yeah, I just want to applaud you, Governor, because in your State of the State address, you address the need to look at mental health illness as an area that we need to fund to make sure that it's much more accessible. And we're looking at the funding of that. But I think we just need to be very careful, because everyone who has a mental illness doesn't mean that they're going to commit murder. And so I think it's real important that we don't demonize people who have mental illness, because I think it's 1 in 4 that can have a mental illness, so that's a lot of folks. And people that work with people who have mental illness are really concerned about what we're doing as it relates to trying to associate these mass murders with mental illness, because the percentage, like you mentioned, is not that great
Governor, I'd like to clear
with
something.
overall gun violence.
I appreciate you saying that. Before I get 100 emails from mental health advocates tomorrow, I'd like to clear up what I was saying earlier. There are only a small fraction
That's right.
of folks with mental health problems that commit these massacres or killings.
Right.
It's also a small fraction of people that own magazines over 20 rounds that commit any kind of crime. And so, in fact, I would suggest that that number is even smaller. And so I think my point earlier was not that we should do something drastic on the mental health side, but rather that there's a correlation there, and that it is clear to me that solving the magazine issue or the background check issue is going to have a very small effect on crime, when in fact what we've been doing, where we are hammering defendants and giving them long jail sentences for being violent, is in fact having a positive impact.
Were you going to say something?
Nope, I'm good.
So, and while we're on that, I think that, because it is a question that gets asked repeatedly, why is the United States so much more violent? People talk about the prevalence of violence in our cinema, on TV, in videos. Do you all think that that's an issue, that these cultural factors contribute to gun violence? If so, how should we think about addressing it?
I think the president just commissioned a study so that he could have the Department of Disease look at this whole issue as it relates to media and violence, because I think that our kids are bombarded a lot with negative images on music and games and movies, and I think that does influence, but that's just my view, and I would like to see some scientific evidence-based research to kind of back that up and to come up with some proposals that might work, but we have to wait to see the outcome.
I can tell you that at least certain of the game companies have done a lot of that research, and they don't think there is a close correlation. So
I'm going to agree with Rhonda, and this is something I think we can fully agree on. We do need more research. We do need to look very closely at this. I find it ironic that some of the same entertainment companies, video games, movies, and they also they say that this doesn't influence young people and so on, but then they turn around and sell advertising and they say it does influence your buying habits. So I find that ironic.
Governor, I guess I would question the premise of the question. England, one of those places that people look to and say, oh, look, they are highly repressive on gun laws, very, very low rates of household gun ownership because of laws, one after the other, designed to deter law-abiding citizens from owning guns. Their total violent crime rate is higher than the United States. Now, if you go ask Piers Morgan, he'll give you a statistic about gun homicides or gun suicides, and that's true. You know, if you outlaw lawnmowers, you'll have fewer lawnmower accidents than countries that permit them. But if you look at their homicide rate fluctuates between 1 and 2. Our homicide rate is in the 4s. Their assault rate is massively higher than ours for serious assaults. Their burglary rate is massively higher than ours in England than in the United States. And in the United States, about a quarter of our burglaries are home invasions. There, it's nearly 60% of an occupied home because, as Senator Morse points out, American burglars are pretty frightened about running into an armed homeowner. They're not at all frightened about that in England. So England is a more dangerously violent country than the United States. And one reason, certainly not the only one reason is the English government has destroyed the culture of self-defense in that country.
Governor, let me go back to an earlier point. One of the things that's interesting, this past summer, the State Chiefs Association had one of the leading police psychologists in this part of the country talk to us about the very issue that you asked about. That is whether or not our young people have become desensitized to violence. And it was his opinion that they certainly have. And I think, to answer your question more directly, based on what the Chiefs Association has been told, and kind of our viewpoint is that there has been a significant desensitization of violence by our young people, and I think that does have an impact on what's going on.
You're saying that that's a result of the media.
The things that were mentioned primarily were things like gaming, the entertainment industry, and things like that. And the example that was given is if you take a look at a movie that was kind of scary back in the 70s when we were younger, and you look at that same movie today, it would probably make you laugh, not make you afraid.
Interesting question. Just to get back to the statistics about Great Britain, you can mix statistics because Great Britain also has a significantly higher beer consumption, which could lead to some of those assaults.
No, they have you're right, they have a much more irresponsible attitude about it. Absolutely.
What's your point exactly?
Americans know how to drink responsibly much more than they do in England.
So the House, we touched on this earlier, the House recently sent 4 gun safety bills to the Senate for consideration. I thought it'd be good to let each of you, or Rhonda, you can start with how you think these bills are going to impact gun violence, and then we can hear a point and counterpoint.
Right. You know, I think that they will impact gun violence because background checks, I believe, is going to make our community less dangerous and it's going to save lives. I believe if you reduce the number of bullets in a magazine to 15, I think that's going to save lives. I think that when you look about the concealed carry on our college campus, that's going to save lives. We're going to see some more bills that's going to address mental health as a duty to warn and to notify, so that's a trigger for CBI checks. So I think that all of these things are just holistic approach to address gun violence in our community. This is a serious, complicated issue, so I don't think it's going to be like one approach that's going to fix everything. But I think that what we're doing are just reasonable approaches to address gun violence.
Ken, why don't you go?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I think background checks is just absolutely insane. First of all, it's not universal. Criminals don't buy guns at gun stores. They steal guns, they trade them for drugs.
Actually, just for the record, just to more fact-based, of the background checks that were people, we've caught, I can't remember how many, I think there were 46 felons that were trying to buy a gun and got background checked. Criminals are often stupid, just so. Okay. So there is some factual basis for that it does catch. It maybe doesn't catch all the crooks, but it catches the dumb ones.
Okay. I'll stipulate that there are dumb criminals.
I'll stipulate.
But I will also ask my friends here in law enforcement to truthfully answer this question. Criminals, the guns that we have traced in murders that are used by gangbangers and drug dealers are typically stolen weapons. They are traded in the criminal underground. These folks are not going to get caught, typically, the smart ones, the above average intelligence ones, aren't going to get caught in a background check, but they will find a way to get a gun and commit a crime. And that's where the serious gun violence in this crime, we can look at massacres and talk about mental health and other things. These are criminal defendants that are part of gangs that shoot people because they have gang pressures on them and financial incentives. And those guns are not guns that are being purchased at gun stores. And so this universal background check is a misnomer. It's not universal. It only is going to stop law-abiding citizens or slow down law-abiding citizens from getting a gun.
Mr. D, I would agree with a lot of what you said. In fact, and another way that oftentimes criminals obtain guns is by having somebody else purchase it for them and then hand it off to them. From the position of the state chiefs, the reason why the state chiefs supported the background checks, we believe that it makes sense to try and keep guns to whatever level we can out of the hands of people who should not have them. And if the universal background check helps do that, we believe it's a good move. And we fully realize that it's not going to keep guns out of the hands of the smart criminals or a lot of people, but it is one step towards keeping some of the guns out of the hands of some of the people that should not have them, and that's why we supported it.
David had his hand up first.
I echo the chief's position that you want to have good laws to try to do the best you can at keeping guns out of the wrong hands, and at the same time, a responsible and balanced approach also recognizes that guns in the right hands are important for public safety. The universal check bill, as it was passed the House, is not balanced because it has, in many provisions, things that keep guns out of the right hands. Let me give you just two quick examples, and there are a lot more. If you are a Boy Scout leader and you have the troop over to your home to teach them gun safety, you're not taking about target shooting, the parents don't want to do that, but you want to have them handle one of your guns just like one at a time, it's unloaded, no ammunition in the room, learn the basics, that kind of safety instruction. And I'm a certified National Rifle Association safety instructor. Part of what you do is teach in rooms, not on target ranges, with unloaded guns. That's prohibited. It's illegal for me as a safety instructor to do that with any student without putting those students through a background check. So I'm trying to teach handgun safety to a crowd of 20, and I have some unloaded handguns for them to handle. Everyone has to go through a background check under this rule, or there are many, many other situations on top of that, but let me mention the most crucial one. Someone who needs a firearm for immediate self-defense. There's a provision in there that seems to address that, but it says you can give the gun to somebody for immediate self-defense if you do it in that person's home, and it's under the same circumstances. It copies this from the law where you'd be justified to shoot someone. So a woman calls, one of my friends calls and says, Dave, there's this stalker who's been like after me. He keeps calling me and calling me and calling me. Can I borrow one of your guns and just have it at my house to protect myself and my children for the next several days? The answer is, she just came by my house. No, I can't give her the gun in my house. I've got to go over to her house to do it. I don't see what the point of that is. And secondly, if I'm obeying the law, I can only give her the gun if she is in imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury. That's the standard under the law at which you can shoot somebody. Well, she's not at the standard where if she sees this guy on the street, she can go shoot him, but he's a dangerous threat. You ought to be able to give a gun to a person who is in reasonable apprehension of danger rather than you can only get a gun in an emergency if you're at the same standard as if which you could shoot somebody. That's just wrong. It doesn't make common sense. And it's the problem with Michael Bloomberg cookie cutter bills being pushed all over this country that just don't make sense.
So I have to completely disagree with your reading of the bill with respect to the Boy Scouts. I don't think there's anything in that bill that comes anywhere close to what you're talking about, although, I have the bill with me and we can certainly in the back room go through it and you can show me where you're right and I'm wrong. But I can assure you, that was certainly not the intent. In terms of the woman that you're trying to...
Sounds like that will be changed in the Senate.
Well, it was brought up on the floor of the House repeatedly.
There was a lot brought up on the floor of the House that was utter nonsense.
This was an issue that was identified on the floor, and people didn't do anything about it.
And then with respect to the woman that's being stalked and whatnot, it seems to me Like, I mean, certainly you could go over to her house with your gun and protect her for the time being because there's an imminent threat. But if she needs a gun for the next week or 2 weeks, run through the background check, because you probably actually don't know as much about her as perhaps you think, and let's just make sure. Because again, these are the kinds of things that, you know, and even as we talk about domestic violence type situations, there are times when, for whatever reason, and not necessarily in this state, the guns are taken from the perpetrator, but then he borrows a gun from a buddy and uses that gun to kill the spouse. It's like, you know, let's, again, if we've got time to run through a background check, let's run through a background check, and then you can have that gun because you are a law-abiding citizen that's entitled to the gun.
You can't go to a gun store on a Saturday night for the background check, and it takes 3 days anyway, which is illegal in violation of the Colorado statute setting up the background checks. So not every woman who's a victim of a stalker has some nice guy who's going to come live with her for 3 days while we wait for the background check to get done.
But she's also, you know, I mean, just in the spirit of, you know, full debate here, we also don't have a plethora of those murders on the front page of the Denver Post. I mean, because we do, you know, we call the police and we get extra patrol checks and we do what we need to do to talk to folks to make sure, you know, let's tone this down so that you don't come and do something to her that you have no business doing. So there's a lot that can be done, that is done.
Governor, can I make one point real quickly?
One quick point.
I think it's real important to point out how partisan this gun bill is. There's not one single Republican in the House that joined on, and there's 3 or 4 Democrats that had the courage to vote no, in spite of the Vice President of the United States calling and strong-arm tactics from Washington, D.C., as opposed to the bills that were passed in the 1993-94 timeframe, where Democrat Governor Romer and Democrat DA and future Governor Bill Ritter led the charge with a Republican legislature, and we saw broad bipartisan support in going after criminals as opposed to going after guns. And I think it is something that is real important when we talk about a state as diverse as Colorado, that the culture of Colorado and this extreme partisanship, I hope the governor takes into account when he decides whether to sign these bills or veto these bills. But I think it's really sad that there is not more consensus because these bills are so far out there.
Yeah. And I think that you have your facts wrong. You know, you really have your facts wrong. Because
name the Republican that signed one.
Well, I know the vote. I know the vote that happened in the House, but where you have your facts wrong is what Colorado voters are saying about background checks. You know, when I look at the polling and what people are saying in my district and when I'm out in the community, everyone is telling me that background check is a reasonable approach to address gun violence. And it does work. It's proven to work. And
Where?
we're just expanding in the state of Colorado. It's working. It's already working.
I thought we had too many violent crimes here.
We do.
All right, that's not the point. That's not the point.